In this video, I make some floating shelves, struggle with somewhat cheap hardware, and struggle even more with my own inadequacies. Maybe you know a crazy plant person, or maybe you are the crazy plant person in your home. If so, then you know the struggle of having too many plants and nowhere to put them. Today, we solved that problem with some heavy-duty floating shelves. My wife asked me for some shelves in our guest room/office, but these couldn't be just any shelves. They're going to have to hold a lot of weight, and they need to be floating shelves. And I mean actual floating shelves. Not the shelves in some of these HGTV shows that they call floating shelves but have visible brackets and mounting hardware and chains holding them up. These are going to be real floating shelves. Or at least they'll look like they're floating. I like to think of it as a magic trick. If you were watching a magician and he said he was going to make an elephant disappear from the stage, and then he just walked the elephant off stage right on a leash, wouldn't that be disappointing? But if you made an entire elephant disappear from behind a curtain, then I'd be impressed. Like, I don't need to see someone actually saw a person in half or literally pull a quarter out of my ear. I don't believe in the supernatural or real magic. But if you can't see how a trick is done, then I still get excited seeing that magic trick. And that's how I think about floating shelves. There's nothing wrong with brackets or visible mounting hardware. Some of them can be quite stylish. But for the love of all that's good and holy, please don't call them floating shelves. So far, you've seen me breaking down some 3/4 inch walnut plywood. This will make up the bulk of the shelves, and we're going to double them up to make a beefier shelf. That's for 3 reasons. 1, I just like the look of a thicker 1.5 inch shelf. Second, we need at least an inch of thickness for hidden brackets that will float these shelves on the wall. And 3, at about 5 feet long, these are kind of long, and I don't want them bowing or flexing under the weight of a bunch of potted plants. We're also going to add some extra hardware to prevent that, but more on the hardware later. Let's get these shelves glued up. From here, I'm just making sure there aren't any gaps, and then we can move on to the second glue up. I let these dry overnight, and then, abracadabra, clamps are gone. After scraping off a little glue squeeze out, I cut these shelves down to their final width and length. And now we can start working with some solid walnut for the edge banding. I wanted something a little thicker than typical iron-on edge banding, so I picked up some rough sawn walnut at my local hardware dealer. And to get a little more character, and save some money, I got what they labeled as rustic walnut. If this wood was a cake on the Great British Bake Off, Paul Hollywood would probably describe it as rough and ready. It has a few knots and cracks here and there, so it costs about half of what their more quality walnut would be. I think I got this stuff for about $7 to $8 a board foot. After cutting some pieces down to rough size, I started planing them down to their final thickness, which will be 1/4 of an inch. With the edge banding milled, it's time to cut it down for the shelves, and I'll basically be framing 3 sides of each shelf. So I pulled out my frame making jig. It's one of the easier ways for me to cut accurate 45-degree angles. Usually the material I cut for frames is lying flat on the jig, but this edge banding needs to be cut vertically, so I use some plywood offcuts as a backer board, since the edge banding is relatively thin. This helps keep the material from bending and snapping and/or getting off of 45 degrees. Butt joints would have been easier, but I think this mitered framing looks nice. Once all of those pieces are cut, we can break out the glue again. For glued-on edge banding, I like using blue painter's tape as my clamps. The tape usually provides enough clamping pressure. These pieces had just enough spring in them that I needed a few clamps to close the gaps. Once that glue is dry, I trimmed off the excess on the ends and planed the edge banding to be closer to flush with the tops and bottoms of the shelves. Let's take a break from the shelves for a few minutes to look at the layout and set up the hardware. This is our guest bedroom, and here's the wall these shelves will mount to. Pots and plants are starting to stack up in every windowsill in the house, but that's what we're here to fix. I laid out the height I wanted for the shelves and found and marked the studs in the wall, which was a pretty arbitrary choice. The height, that is. The studs were where they were, of course, and that was all over the place. I don't know who built this wall, but I'm pretty sure they had never heard of 16-inch centers. You know what? Good for them. I'm just glad stud finders were invented. We can finally start drilling some holes. The first hole for each of these brackets is probably the most important, as it's going to hold the most weight. The back rod fits snugly into the stud and prevents the shelf from tipping forward. A couple of drywall anchors and screws prevents this first piece from pulling away from the wall and out of the stud. The second piece can now be attached to the first. This piece has the rod that will be inserted into the shelves. There are also 4 set screws in this second piece that provide adjustability to each of the brackets, so if things are a little off, you can still get them to line up with some fine tuning. Not that we're going to need that. Everything's going to fit perfectly the first time. Now we can repeat the process for the remaining brackets. Each shelf is getting 3 brackets. Rockler's packaging says that 2 brackets on a shelf can hold up to 125 pounds. So by my math, each of these shelves should be able to hold maybe several hundred pounds? That's how math works, right? It turns out the crazy stud placement in this wall worked out well. I'm offsetting the shelves from each other, and I was able to put a bracket on each end and one roughly in the middle. I think offsetting them will give a little visual interest, and then my wife can put at least one taller plant on the end if she wants to. With the brackets now installed, I can set up the shelves to mark out where I will drill the holes and mortises in the shelves themselves. And now back in the shop, I can finish marking these shelves up. I'm making the mortises just a little bigger than they need to be, so I have some wiggle room when I go to install them. This 7/8 inch Forstner bit is just the right size to clear out most of the material. And a little chiseling to finish it up. Then finally drilling the hole for that shelf side rod. So this first attempt to install the bottom shelf was a bit frustrating and time consuming for a couple of reasons. I actually was expecting a little trial and error to get all 3 brackets to line up with the holes in the shelf, but I ran into another problem. I had to pull the shelf off so many times that the brackets started pulling away from the wall. Those drywall anchors were supposed to prevent that. And upon closer inspection, the drywall anchors didn't fail, but the screws that came with them apparently were the wrong size. They pulled completely out of the anchors. Fortunately, I had these heavier duty anchors that actually screw into the drywall. I think each of these is rated for 50 pounds, so with this upgrade, and my math, I can probably load these shelves with at least a few hundred more pounds now. With those sorted, I can get back to making adjustments to get this shelf to fit. It took a few tries, and I finally realized that I hadn't drilled my holes deep enough or given myself enough wiggle room for my mortises. So I corrected that, and presto, it finally fit. A quick check for level across the shelf and from front to back. That front comes up a bit, but I left it that way to compensate for the hundreds of pounds of pots and plants that are inevitably going to weigh this down. The test fit of the second higher shelf was way easier and went on the first go. That was such a relief. I mean, I totally expected that and was not surprised at all when it went on so easily. What was not surprising was that this wall was far from flat, so I scribed a line on the back of each shelf and took them over to the bandsaw to trim them up. And then it was time for one more test fit, and these were looking pretty good, so I carried them back to the shop one last time. So we can finally get to sanding and finishing these shelves. Well, almost. I need to, let's say, enhance some of the character in that rough and ready walnut edge banding and fill in a few cracks and holes. For that, I'm going to use some Starbond CA glue. This stuff is already tinted dark brown, and with a little accelerator, it cures instantly. And then we can get to sanding. And when you've got a little gap that just needs a little filling in, a bit of wood glue and sanding over with the dust extraction off will give you a nice little matching wood filler. Here I'm using a block sander to put a slight chamfer on the edges to break them so they aren't quite so sharp. That way when I run into them after forgetting I installed them, I just get a concussion and not a full bleeding laceration. And finally, time for the finish. We're wrapping this up with a hard wax oil finish, Rubio Monocoat. It's a two-part finish that's really easy to put on and is nearly foolproof. Spread it on, wipe it off, give it a few days to fully cure, and you're good to go. I'm using Rubio Black because I like darkening the walnut to make it look a bit like natural black walnut. Walnut can also lighten and blonde out over time, especially with sun exposure, so this should help it remain darker for some time. Okay, time for the final install, and to load up the now thousands of pounds of plants that I'm sure these shelves can hold.